there is a word that is almost always used negatively, as if it represented excess, imbalance, or selfishness, but which, when directed correctly, can become the turning point. For a woman who decides to change her own lifestyle, obsession, for a long time, you learned not to be too intense, not to want too much, not to focus too much on yourself, as if prioritizing your own growth was something exaggerated or even inappropriate. But the truth is that many women aren't tired of life. They're tired of living without clear direction, without a real commitment to what they say they want, and without a minimum level of self-demand. Being obsessed with yourself doesn't mean becoming selfish or ignoring the world around you. It means accepting that responsibility for your growth can no longer be outsourced to circumstances, time, or luck. It means looking at your days and asking yourself maturely, am I truly living to my fullest potential? Or am I just occupying space within a routine that's too comfortable to be questioned? Perhaps you'll say you're exhausted. Exhausted from the routine, the obligations, the internal pressures, the constant feeling that I should be further along than I am. But before concluding that life is too heavy, it's necessary to consider a more honest possibility. Perhaps what's weighing us down isn't an excess of responsibilities, but a lack of intentional focus. When a woman isn't obsessed with her own evolution, she begins to live reactively, dealing with whatever comes up, responding to whatever arises, filling her time with tasks that keep everything running, but not necessarily fostering growth. She spends the day busy, but ends the night with the uneasy feeling that nothing has really changed inside her. And this feeling, repeated for weeks and months, begins to transform into a weariness that seems to come from life, but in reality stems from stagnation. Being obsessed with yourself means deciding that your discipline matters. It's about understanding that your dreams can't continue to be treated as just interesting ideas that you revisit when you feel inspired. It's about accepting that undeveloped potential translates into silent frustration. In this video, I want to invite you to observe clear signs that perhaps you are not taking yourself as seriously as you could. Not so that you criticize yourself, but so that you awaken. Because life starts to respond differently when you change your level of commitment. And if you feel you could be living more, growing more, building more, perhaps it's not a lack of opportunity. Perhaps it's a lack of focused obsession. Be obsessed with yourself, not impulsively, but strategically. Not out of vanity, but for expansion. And in the next few minutes, I want you to honestly acknowledge whether you are truly getting the most out of your life, or if you are still living below the potential of the woman you could be. Be obsessed with yourself begins with an uncomfortable but necessary question. When was the last time you finished a day feeling like you truly made progress, that you got closer to a stronger, more disciplined, and more self-aware version of yourself? The first sign that you're not taking yourself seriously is simple yet profound. Sign 1. Your days go by and you can't identify any real growth. You wake up, deal with demands, answer messages, fulfill obligations, organize small details of your routine, and in the end, you feel like you've been busy the whole time, but you can't point to anything that required overcoming challenges, learning, or concrete growth. The problem isn't having responsibilities. The problem is living by repeating patterns that keep everything running, but don't build anything new within you. A woman obsessed with herself observes her own progress attentively because she understands that growth doesn't happen by accident. It happens through sustained intention. The second signal appears even more quietly. Sign 2. You consume more than you build. You read about discipline, listen to insights on mindset, save videos about self-improvement, and are inspired by stories of determined women. But your own life remains practically unchanged because most of your energy is directed toward absorbing ideas, not executing them. Consuming is comfortable, building is demanding. Consuming fuels the feeling of movement. Building demands responsibility. When you spend more time preparing to act than actually acting, you create the illusion of growth without facing the discomfort of practice. Being obsessed with you means reducing the time spent admiring you and increasing the time spent executing your actions, even when those actions are imperfect and slow. The third sign is perhaps the most revealing. Sign 3. You talk about change, but you don't schedule concrete actions. You say you want to improve your health, develop new skills, organize your finances, strengthen your mind. But these intentions rarely translate into structured commitments with dates, times, and consistency. As long as your desires remain in the realm of ideas, your reality continues to obey the same patterns. Not taking yourself seriously means treating your goals as optional possibilities, something you'll do when you're more motivated, more rested, or less busy. A woman obsessed with herself doesn't wait for the ideal scenario to begin. She creates a minimum of structure and sticks to it, even when the initial excitement fades. When your days go by without growth, when you consume more than you build, and when your plans don't translate into consistent actions, a feeling of stagnation begins to set in. And this stagnation, over time, disguises itself as weariness. You believe you're exhausted by life, when in reality, you're exhausted from repeating old versions of yourself. Be obsessed with yourself enough to observe your days honestly, because as long as you don't take responsibility for your own growth, you will continue to wait for something external to produce a change that can only arise from your internal decision. Being obsessed with yourself requires a level of honesty that few people are willing to maintain for very long. Because looking clearly at your own standards means abandoning the comfortable narrative that you're doing everything you can. There is a profound difference between trying and being committed. And it is precisely in this difference that many women remain stuck for years, believing that the mere desire to change is already sufficient proof of effort. Sign 4. You are waiting for motivation to act. You say you'll start when you're feeling more energized, when the day is lighter, when the week is less hectic, when you feel that initial energy that seems to make everything easier. But motivation is unstable and emotionally volatile. While growth requires consistency, even on days when you feel absolutely nothing, when you base your actions on your emotional state, you transfer control of your progress to something unreliable. And each postponement silently reinforces the idea that your goals are not a real priority. A woman obsessed with herself understands that discipline doesn't come from excitement, but from repeated decisions. Even when enthusiasm fades and only commitment remains, the next sign is even more subtle, but equally powerful. Sign 5. You avoid discomfort whenever it threatens your safe zone. You want to grow, but you don't want to expose yourself to the risk of failure. You want to evolve, but you don't want to give up habits that offer immediate pleasure. You want different results, but you don't want to go through the uncomfortable process that precedes them. And while trying to preserve their comfort zone, they also preserve that same reality. Discomfort is often interpreted as a sign that something is wrong, when in fact it is the clearest indicator that you are approaching a new level. If you retreat whenever you feel fear, insecurity, or doubt, you end up training your mind to associate protection with stagnation, and this gradually weakens your self-confidence. Every time you run away from a difficult decision, you send yourself the message that you don't trust your own ability to overcome challenges. Being obsessed with you means accepting that discomfort is not the enemy. It's a structural part of growth. It means understanding that true self-esteem doesn't come from kind words you repeat in front of the mirror, but from the consistency between what you promise yourself and what you actually do. When you wait for motivation and avoid discomfort, you begin to live in a cycle of intention without action, and this cycle produces a specific type of frustration, one that doesn't explode but accumulates silently. You look at your own life and feel that you could be at another level, that you could have built more, learned more, dared more, but you continue to behave as if you are waiting for an invisible permission to finally begin. Become obsessed with yourself to the point of ceasing to negotiate with your escape impulses. Be obsessed with yourself to the point of acting even when your emotions are against you. Because as long as you keep waiting to feel like committing, you'll continue living below the level of the woman you already know you could be. Being obsessed with yourself also means lucidly monitoring what occupies your attention, because your life is built not only by the big decisions you make, but mainly by how you manage your energy in the seemingly small and harmless moments of the day. There is a silent pattern that prevents many women from growing at the speed they could, and it rarely presents itself as something serious or alarming because it often disguises itself as entertainment, well-deserved rest, or a simple daily habit. Sign 6. You get distracted whenever you need to face something important. Every time a task arises that demands real focus, intellectual courage, or emotional effort, something seemingly more urgent appears, such as a notification, a side conversation, irrelevant organization, or any activity that keeps your mind occupied but distant from what could actually generate progress. This avoidance isn't noisy, it isn't dramatic, and it isn't always conscious, but it creates a pattern in which you spend more time avoiding challenges than facing them. And this silently undermines your own confidence. When you constantly postpone what you know you need to do, you begin to build an internal image of yourself as someone who starts a lot and finishes little, and this perception weakens your stance towards your own life. Being obsessed with yourself implies developing the ability to stay focused on the difficult task even when your mind craves distraction, because it is precisely there, in that initial resistance, that growth begins to happen. The next sign is directly linked to how you interpret your own reality. Sign 7. You complain about your current situation, but you don't reorganize your priorities. You feel you could be at another level, that your routine could be more productive, that your results could be more consistent. But when you look at how you distribute your time, you realize that what is truly important rarely occupies the central space on your agenda. It's not a matter of lack of ability, but of a lack of clear hierarchy. You claim you want to evolve, but you allow superficial commitments and low-impact tasks to dictate the pace of your days. Meanwhile, the projects that could transform her reality continue to wait for a more decisive version of herself. Complaining without restructuring is a subtle way of remaining in the same place while maintaining the feeling that you are doing something about it. A woman obsessed with herself doesn't ignore her responsibilities, but learns to differentiate between what is urgent and what is essential, and understands that poorly defined priorities produce mediocre results. When distraction becomes a habit and priorities remain confused, time begins to slip through your fingers without you realizing it, and the feeling of stagnation returns with even greater force. You believe you're tired of life, but perhaps you're tired of knowing exactly what needs to be done and continuing to choose paths that preserve your immediate comfort. Be obsessed with yourself to the point of protecting your attention with the same seriousness with which you would protect something valuable, because your attention determines your direction, and your direction defines who you become. If you don't take control of what occupies your days, you will continue to be driven by automatic patterns that were not consciously chosen. And no woman who wants to live life to the fullest can afford to live distracted. There comes a pivotal moment in your journey when you realize with absolute clarity that you could be living at a much higher level, but you continue to choose what is comfortable, predictable, and safe, even knowing that this comfort no longer represents you. The 8th sign emerges when this awareness ceases to be subtle and begins to bother you, because you clearly see your potential. Feel the strength you could be directing towards something greater, but still allow yourself to remain where the effort is less and the pressure is almost non-existent. At this point, it's no longer a lack of ability, nor a lack of opportunity, nor a scarcity of talent, but a silent negotiation with mediocrity itself, where you soften your ambitions so you don't have to face the inevitable discomfort of real growth. You begin to understand that the biggest obstacle isn't outside, but in the repetition of small choices that preserve familiar habits instead of expanding your identity. And you realize that each comfortable decision reinforces the limited version of who you could be. The structural shift happens when you decide to end this internal negotiation with maturity and firmness, accepting that being obsessed with yourself means stopping accepting elegant justifications for behaviors that sabotage your own progress. Being obsessed with yourself isn't about living in constant tension, but about acting consistently between what you know you're capable of doing and what you actually do every day, especially when no one is watching or validating your effort. Change begins with small, repeated decisions, such as keeping commitments you've set for yourself, organizing your time intentionally, and choosing what strengthens your mind instead of what merely distracts it momentarily. These choices may seem insignificant when viewed in isolation, but accumulated, they build a disciplined identity. And identity is what sustains lasting results when motivation fades. When you stop negotiating with your own mediocrity, you stop romanticizing the idea that it's not the right time yet, and accept that the right time comes from consistent action, not from comfortable waiting. You understand that discipline is a high form of self-love because it represents loyalty to the promises you've made to yourself and respect for the woman you want to become. The energy that arises from this decision is neither impulsive nor desperate, but firm, serene, and determined because it comes from the clarity that remaining small hurts more than facing the discomfort of growing. At this stage, you don't seek applause, you don't announce dramatic changes, and you don't try to convince anyone of your evolution because you understand that structural transformation is silent and reveals itself in the patterns you uphold daily. The final sign, therefore, is not an accusation, but a definitive invitation to maturity, as it places before you the choice between remaining comfortable and limited or assuming full responsibility for your own potential. And when you repeatedly choose what expands you instead of what merely preserves you, you're not just improving habits, you're rebuilding your inner structure and finally living the true meaning of being obsessed with yourself. There is a silent and inevitable change that happens when you decide to take yourself seriously, because life begins to respond not to what you superficially desire, but to the pattern you consistently uphold in your choices, attitudes, and boundaries. For a long time, you may have waited for external circumstances to align so that you could, finally, live in a way that was more in line with your potential. But the mature and liberating truth is that the world adjusts to the woman who sets a new internal standard and refuses to compromise it. When you raise your standards, you change how you position yourself, how you manage your time, how you select environments, how you set priorities, and, most importantly, how you react to situations that previously destabilize you. And this transformation silently alters everything around you. A healthy obsession with oneself is not vanity or an inflated ego, but a deep commitment to one's own growth, a conscious vigilance over one's habits, thoughts, and decisions, which prevents one from returning to a casual way of living, where everything is done without clear intention. Living casually means accepting disorganized days, automatic choices, and postponed goals, while living with a high standard requires presence, discipline, and emotional responsibility, because you understand that every small action reinforces or weakens the identity you are building. When you become obsessed with yourself in the most mature sense of the word, you don't get distracted easily. You're not impressed by just any opportunity, and you don't allow yourself to remain in situations that drain your energy because you understand that your growth depends on the quality of the decisions you repeat daily. Life begins to expand when you stop acting impulsively and start acting with direction. When you replace reactivity with strategy, and when you transform internal promises into non-negotiable commitments, sustained even on days when motivation seems distant, you realize that you don't need to force results, because by adjusting your pattern, you naturally attract circumstances more aligned with the woman you are becoming. Since the world responds to the clarity, firmness, and consistency you demonstrate, this growth doesn't happen dramatically or noisily, but structurally, and is built on the repetition of consistent attitudes that consolidate your self-confidence and broaden your vision of what is possible for your life. By abandoning a casual approach and adopting an intentional stance, you discover that true growth doesn't depend on luck, but on positioning. And that positioning stems from the daily decision to prioritize yourself with maturity and courage. From that moment on, you stop waiting for external validation to act and begin to trust your own direction. Understanding that security doesn't come from the absence of challenges, but from the certainty that you are prepared to face them. If you feel ready to experience this new phase with more clarity, discipline, and inner strength, continue walking this path of personal growth. Because when you change your pattern, you not only transform your reality, you redefine who you are and open up space for a life that finally matches your true potential. If this content made you realize it's time to raise your standards and stop living in casual mode, like this video to strengthen that decision and signal to yourself that you're ready to grow with intention. Follow the channel to continue delving deeper into this new phase of your life. Because here, you'll find reflections that don't indulge mediocrity, but awaken your strongest, most conscious, and disciplined self. And tell me in the comments which pattern you decided to change starting today. Because when you put your decision into words, you transform intention into commitment and take the first real step towards becoming truly obsessed with yourself